Good evening. So let us start from where we left off. A triumph of surgery we were discussing the other day. Let's discuss the rest of it. So what happened after Tricky was taken by Dr. Harriet? At the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Surged means they uh, they thronged him. They came crowded to see Tricky. Surgery is a place where Dr. Harriet used to treat his other dogs. He's a veterinary doctor, I hope you remember. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. So Tricky was new to this place, so he was surprised to see so many dogs. He's never seen so many dogs in his life. The other dogs, after sniffling around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So other dogs found him rather fat and inactive, so he's quite uninteresting to them. So they went off on their own and they left Tricky. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. So, in spite of his elaborate night beds and day beds, Tricky now has a loose box which is warm to sleep. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the other dogs in the yard. That means he was slowly reacting to his surroundings. He was doing very badly when he was brought into the surgery, and now he's slowly recovering on the second day. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound. Joe, the greyhound, came and he wanted to play with Tricky and his friends, that means the other dogs. After rolling over him and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. So here at the surgery, the dogs are allowed to move around a open space, which he calls the garden, and play on their own. So it's important to exercise. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. So later, when feeding time came, doctor was present to see what was going on. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. Tristan, maybe the doctor's assistant, who was putting food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush, followed by sound of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. So each dog had to finish his food fast. Otherwise, if he is slow, his friends might come and eat the rest of his meal. That happens at feeding times. So when they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls. Licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So finally, Tricky started showing interest in food. You remember the condition he was brought into the surgery? He was completely unable to eat. He was having bouts of vomiting. But now he's showing interest to food. Maybe the exercise did the trick. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs. joining in their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages is fights. Okay. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled on, squashed every few minutes. So you must have seen how dogs play with each other. They roll over each other, uh, they trample each other, and all that. So they were having a great time playing with each other. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely silky object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. So Tricky was now behaving like a normal dog, though he was pretty small compared to size, compared in comparison to the other dogs who were rather big. Tricky was a small silky object, but he was as fierce. He was becoming as fierce as the others, and he was fighting for his meals. He was no longer that sloppy fat dog. He had never had such a time in his life. So all his life he had spent with Mrs. Pomfrey, who used to spoil him with every kind of comfort and didn't give him enough opportunity to play around. So now he was having a good time. All the while, Mrs. Pomfrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. Bulletins means news. So she was worried about Tricky. I dodged the question about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his coat worn according to the weather. So she was worried whether his bed was being regularly made properly, whether he was changing his coat. I wish she could see what was going inside the surgery. She would have been shocked. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Convalescing means recovering. He was getting better by the day. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pomfrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. So now you see how she made Tricky fat by feeding and feeding and feeding. So now she started sending eggs to the veterinary hospital. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. So she also used to feed her little dog some wine to improve its Tricky's blood. Who feeds wine to dogs? She must be out of her mind. Think of it. So what did the doctor do with the wine and the eggs? Well, he ate them. He and his partner had a wonderful lunch and a wonderful dinner with the eggs and wine. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during meal. So he was enjoying the wine sent by Mrs. Pomfrey for Tricky. So the doctor was having a great time. Okay, now we go over to the next page. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution, his body. Now Mrs. Pomfrey sent in brandy to improve Tricky's body. She really overdoes things. A few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. Reverently means honorably or respectfully. So, all these goodies that were sent by Mrs. Pomfrey for Tricky was being consumed by the doctor. Amazing. Of course, Tricky had no need for all this. You understand that. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. So the doctor was having a great time. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. So now you see the question that we were asked in the previous section, why the doctor planned to keep Tricky as a permanent guest. Because of the supplies he was getting from Mrs. Pomfrey, because of, to be fed to Tricky. And those were really amazing, and the doctor was enjoying those. So he wanted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest. But I knew Mrs. Pomfrey was suffering. But he felt bad for Mrs. Pomfrey. She was pretty much in love with the dog. And after a fortnight means a period of 14 days, 15 days actually, 2 weeks, felt compelled. The doctor felt that he should to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. So he informed Mrs. Pomfrey that Tricky was doing well and could be taken home now. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. So Mrs. Pomfrey came within a few minutes, and she came in a limousine which was 30 feet long. So imagine how rich, stinkingly rich she was. So we were asked this question in the previous section, whether you think Mrs. Pomfrey was rich. We got plenty of evidence in the first section. Now it is more confirmed. She came to collect her dog in a limousine. I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pomfrey almost lost in the interior. So when the chauffeur opened the door, he could see Mrs. Pomfrey sitting inside. Insides were rather dark. Her lips trembling, her hands clasped in front of her, and her lips trembled. So she was pretty nervous. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" So she was very worried about Tricky. "Yes, he's fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." Why do you think the doctor didn't want Mrs. Pomfrey to step out of the car? Maybe he didn't want Mrs. Pomfrey to see what goes on inside his little clinic. So he thought it's better that he brought the dog out. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ear flapping, tail waving, was little golden figure of Tricky. So Tricky was still playing in the garden. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe. Lithe means agile. He's very flexible and sporty now, hard-muscled animal. So he had grown muscles, so he was strong now. So exercising and his diet did the trick. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So his physique had visibly improved, so was his agility. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. And the chauffeur, I hope you know what's a chauffeur. It's the people who drive the car. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap. So Tricky went straight to his mistress, leaping greatly across from the doctor's arm to his mistress. Mistress's lap, okay, and sailed into Mrs. Pomfrey's lap. So he gave a huge jump and landed on Mrs. Pomfrey's lap. She gave a startled "ooh," and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds and toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. So he helped the chauffeur to bring out all Tricky's things while Tricky was uh, getting friendly with his mistress. Tricky must have missed his mistress and was showing all the love he had for her. So once all Tricky's things arrived, as the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes, so you can see how emotional she was and how much she must have loved the little dog. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriot," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So according to Mrs. Pumphrey, she seriously thought that Tricky became so healthy again just because, maybe because of a surgery which Dr. Harriot had done on him. Whereas we know the fact there was no surgery, it was just exercise and diet. So I hope you have enjoyed the story. We would discuss the questions and answers sometime in the next video. Meanwhile, I want you to go through it again and understand the underlying satire. There is a satire on the higher class people of the society who have weird, ways of keeping their pets. So hope you enjoy the underlying satire and appreciate it. And please go through the questions. We will discuss the answers in the next video.